The Old Testament reading today is Psalm 126, and we'll be doing it responsively. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we rejoiced. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the water courses of the Negeb. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. The New Testament reading is from Hebrews chapter 7, verses 23 to 28. Furthermore, the former priests were many in number, because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently, because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able for all time to save those who approach God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting that we should have a high priest, holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, and then for those of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests those who are subject to weakness. But the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever.
The gospel lesson comes from the 10th chapter again of the Gospel of Mark, verses 46 to 52. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. A few weeks ago, actually just a few short verses ago, in this 10th chapter of Mark, at verse 36, we read about James and John telling Jesus that they wanted him to do something for them. It was a manipulative request rooted in selfish ambition. He responded, "What is it you want me to do for you?" Their answer demonstrated once again that the very ones who had been with him from the beginning still didn't understand what either Jesus' ministry or God's reign was all about. And now in this morning's gospel, in that same chapter 10, reading at verse 51, Jesus again asks someone, "What do you want me to do for you?" This time, he's no longer talking to any of his close disciples, but rather a blind beggar who has never encountered Jesus before. On one level, this is just another healing story, although it's not like any of the other healing stories. On another level, this is a call story. None of the other healing stories in Mark ever mentions the name of the person healed by Jesus. Here we have Bartimaeus, apparently making a nuisance out of himself, trying to get Jesus' attention. He was sitting in the dust, as was appropriate for a blind beggar. But in crying out for Jesus' attention, Bartimaeus said something striking. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He said it twice. Calling Jesus the Son of David was effectively recognizing him as the long-awaited Messiah. Other than Peter, back in chapter 8, no one else reported in Mark had actually recognized Jesus as the Messiah. And here sits a blind beggar by the side of the road, crying out for Jesus' help and naming him as the Messiah. Is it any wonder that Jesus responded as he did? People around him, including probably some of the disciples, were telling Bartimaeus to shut up. But Bartimaeus was not to be silenced or intimidated. And his words caught Jesus' attention. He stopped in his tracks. Listen again to the words of verse 49. Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up. He is calling you." And so Bartimaeus came to Jesus. He was called by Jesus, and he responded. This was a blind beggar whose only possession might have been his cloak. And when Jesus calls him, he throws off his cloak and jumped up and went to Jesus. He discarded the only possession that he had in order to eagerly and expectantly go to Jesus. Compare that act of faith to the rich man who was invited to follow Jesus after giving up his possessions. When Bartimaeus came forward, Jesus asked him the same question that earlier he had asked James and John. "What do you want me to do for you?" But unlike James and John, Bartimaeus' answer was simple and direct. "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus doesn't touch him or do any clever techniques to impress anyone who might be watching. He simply observes, "Your faith has made you well." And he regained his sight immediately. Then one more thing happened that makes this different from every other healing story. In Mark, Jesus always told the others that he had healed to tell no one and to go back to their homes. He knows Bartimaeus' name and allows Bartimaeus to follow him. As Mark tells the story, what happens next is Jesus' so-called triumphant entry into Jerusalem and the week that led to his death and his triumph. Bartimaeus is the last one that Jesus calls to follow him to Jerusalem. We could spend a very long time just studying the 6th through 10th chapters of the Gospel of Mark. It's a very rich set of interconnected passages leading directly to the final entry into Jerusalem. When I watch and read the news, I often come upon a complaint regarding some policy issue or another that says that the people most affected by the policy have not been included in the conversation. Congress debates welfare issues, and the debate is held among relatively wealthy people with little or no experience of poverty. And poor people aren't asked for their opinions. They're told to remain quiet and unobtrusive, and they'll be taken care of. Congress debates issues on women's rights. The debate is often carried out among elderly men with few or no women at the table. I don't think I've ever come upon a debate about men's rights. Have you? For generations, people with physical disabilities pleaded for consideration of the issues they must face, and no one listened. Coincidentally, those charged with hearing those pleas had no physical disabilities. But finally, in 1990, President George Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. We often want the people who we think are in need of our help to remain unobtrusive and quiet because we know what's best for them. In many ways, we in the church are guilty of the same thing. We often practice what has been called toxic charity, in which we minister to poor or disadvantaged people whether they like it or not. We send out mission groups to provide aid to people without asking those people what they would like or how can we help them. The list could go on and on. Bartimaeus had a physical disability. In the first century, it was common to believe that a physical problem was a sign of sin. If a child were born with a disability, the sin was assumed to have come from the parents. Reading the description of Bartimaeus' blindness, it sounds like he might have had sight at some point, but something happened that made him blind. In that case, it would have been the sin of Bartimaeus that caused his blindness. So here he was, a sinner, blind, with no value in society. He would have been rejected by polite society. He became a beggar, sitting on the side of the road, begging for a few coins or food so that he might stay alive. But he knew he was to be unobtrusive, not making noise or annoying people. If he annoyed people, he could easily get kicked or beaten or robbed. He could lose the only hope he had of staying alive. He knew that. Nevertheless, this blind man saw more clearly than most of the disciples that Jesus, this very Jesus who was passing by, was indeed the long-awaited Messiah. And he cries out to Jesus and begs not for money or food, but for mercy. We're told that the crowd sternly ordered him to be quiet. Sternly definitely implies an effort at intimidation, and perhaps even the threat of violence, unless he quiets down. What Bartimaeus knew in his heart was that being in the presence of this man, this Jesus, was more important to his life than the threats of the crowd. And so he cries out a second time, "Son of David, have mercy on me." It was too important for him to remain silent and unobtrusive. It was a courageous act of faith. Jesus couldn't ignore that. He stopped and called Bartimaeus to him, asking once again, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus' answer was simple and direct, "Let me see again." Jesus did nothing. Jesus did nothing. Instead, he announced that this faith that Bartimaeus had demonstrated, that he had proclaimed, calling out the Messiah in the face of threats and derision, had made him well. His faith had made him well. I have to wonder about my faith. Despite all the rhetoric about the persecution of Christians in this country, I feel secure in the notion that I am not going to put my life in jeopardy if I go out and declare my belief that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, who paid a ransom with his life to redeem us so that we might return to full life in the kingdom of God. Oh, some people might ridicule me. Some people might even stop and want to talk to me. But I don't really think that my life would be in jeopardy. Bartimaeus was a nobody. He was a beggar who was supposed to remain silent, sitting there in the dust. And if he behaved himself, someone would give him something. But he had to remain unobtrusive and silent. That was the only way he could squeak out a living. The only way. He was prepared to put his life in jeopardy to ask the Messiah to have mercy on him. To ask the Messiah to heal him. Do I have the faith to place myself in that kind of jeopardy just to cry out aloud to Jesus, "Have mercy on me"? Do I have the faith of this oft forgotten man? We often talk about being the arms and legs of Jesus in this world. I don't think I've ever heard anyone pray that they could be the eyes of Jesus, seeing the world through his eyes, seeing the things that bring him joy, seeing the things that cause him great sorrow, seeing the things that break his heart. If we have the faith to cry out to Jesus like Bartimaeus, are we prepared to answer Jesus' question, "What do you want from me?" Do we have the courage to ask that our blindness be lifted? That we be given the sight to see the injustice in the world, the violence in the world, the hunger in the world, the ruthlessness that treats people like commodities. Can we bear to watch the things that break Christ's heart? Do we have the faith of Bartimaeus and the will to give up our blindness and really see? Amen.